If you are a Trump supporter, these communists are coming for you online. This is a digital holocaust of conservatives, Christians, and anyone who dares dissent from the communist oligarch regime. Remember the Holodomor because that is what comes next. Keep the faith.
I sit here and suffer so much for you all, and you still won't like and subscribe and become a patron? Come on. It's okay. We'll get through this. Same way we got through the Matrix trilogy, frustrated with the storyline, but so intrigued by the symbolism of it all. Now, conservatives, you're not being persecuted. I mean, you're persecuting me a little bit by making me read tweets like that. Just kidding. But you're not being persecuted. And Christians, you're also not being persecuted. I'll get to you in a bit, my beautiful brethren. But before that, this was tweeted by Gab, which is an alternative social media app that conservatives are rushing to after the shutdown of Parler, which was the other social media app where right-wing extremists can speak freely, and now it's gone. And Parler just launched in August 2018, getting its name from the French word parler, which means to speak. And I guess the rest of the internet was like, ferme ta putain de gueule. Gab is also getting a lot of users after the deletion of 70,000 fashy Twitter accounts, including twice impeached President Donald Trump's account. Man, Trump has been impeached more times than I've been in a healthy relationship, y'all. More times than I get a text back, bro. More times than I've gotten a stimulus check, for real. More times than I've read Aquinas. And that's 2 more times in that case. Here's an excerpt from Twitter's statement on deleting the accounts. They said, "We've been clear that we will take strong enforcement action on behavior that has potential to lead to offline harm. Given the violent events in Washington, D.C. and increased risk of harm, we began permanently suspending thousands of accounts that were primarily dedicated to sharing QAnon content on Friday afternoon. Many of the individuals impacted by this updated enforcement action held multiple accounts, driving up the total number of accounts impacted. Since Friday, more than 70,000 accounts have been suspended as a result of our efforts, with many instances of a single individual operating numerous accounts. These accounts were engaged in sharing harmful QAnon-associated content at scale and were primarily dedicated to the propagation of this conspiracy theory across the service." And they affirmed their stance against coordinated harmful activity, and they talked about the way they determine that activity in their policies, saying, "We must find both evidence that individuals associated with a group, movement, or campaign are engaged in some form of coordination, and that the results of that coordination cause harm to others." And yeah, it's the end of an era for all the QAnon moms out there. How am I supposed to find all the fresh red pill music QAnon rappers now?
Red pill music. I say it's a no-go. They say abortion and I say it's a no-go. They want Hillary, I say Guantanamo. I ride the 45. They wanna turn a boy into a girl, I'm shouting it's a no-go. They wiretapping down, oh baby, that's a no-go. You say Obama, I say Guantanamo. I ride the 45.
I'll probably be fine. Now let me break this Twitter thing down. Conservatives, you're not being persecuted when Twitter deletes your accounts. Also, you're not being silenced or censored or stripped of your First Amendment rights when a private company deletes the account that you made on their website. Remember when you said a woman can refuse to bake a cake for a gay wedding because it's a private business? Same logic. And as for Twitter's platform, they will remove any content that could lead to the potential of committing violent acts. Because committing violent acts, as it turns out, is against the law. And that sounds like an obvious point, but it's an important one in understanding the real reasons Twitter makes these decisions. Law-breaking is the real culprit. If a private company gets caught encouraging law-breaking, then the government can come and step in and close the company or at least place heavy restrictions on it. And so Twitter is constantly overcorrecting to avoid that risk. And that also looks like deleting leftist accounts too. I've seen leftist accounts suspended all the time. So at the end of the day, Twitter has to be overly cautious to protect their own private economic interests. I'm not saying that's good or bad, and I don't really care for private corporations. I'm just saying that when Twitter deletes your account on their website, that's not persecution. That's my point. Now, as for the part of the tweet that says they're coming for Christians too, that's just perpetuating the myth that evangelical Christians in the United States are persecuted. They're not. Christians in certain parts of the Middle East are legitimately persecuted today. And sometimes evangelical Christians will use that fact to argue that Christians are persecuted everywhere. But what's also funny about them using that fact is that most of the Christians that are actually persecuted in the Middle East aren't evangelicals, but are Eastern Orthodox Christians. And according to evangelical theology, their theology is heretical, and according to some evangelical groups, so heretical that they'd be damned to hell. So evangelical Christians using stories of the persecution of Eastern Orthodox Christians to argue that they're persecuted too is disingenuous in multiple ways. And I got major love for my Eastern Orthodox homies out there. And that's from me and from the Sun. So Christians in the United States are not persecuted. And if you are a Christian in the United States and are persecuted, then it's probably because of other parts of your identity, like your race or your ability or your sexual orientation or your gender identity, which may result in you being persecuted by your fellow Christians. And the Puritan Christians had a false persecution complex too. This isn't new. They said that they immigrated here because the Dutch were religiously persecuting them, when in reality, they were just a bunch of fail sons who were mad that they couldn't dominate in the Netherlands. And so they came over here. And as they built a new society, they used this persecution myth to justify persecuting every other religious group outside of Calvinist Puritan Christianity. Come on, Calvinists. How are you going to say that God chose y'all and then act like totally uncool little ignorant piss babies and start an inquisition when a Quaker wants to have a meeting at Karen's house? Get out of here. The contemporary persecution complex that we see among Christians today only began to emerge after Christians lost two legendary Supreme Court cases, Engel versus Vitale in 1962 and Abington versus Schempp in 1963, which restricted prayer in schools. And the ruling was legally sanctioned or officially mandated Bible reading and prayer in public schools is unconstitutional. Which is good and true. Forced prayers and Bible readings is never cool. And then the persecution complex really picked up steam with the formation of the moral majority in the late 70s, which began with its core issue being keeping Christian universities racially segregated. The idea of Republicans fighting for religious freedoms on behalf of evangelicals only began with the formation of the moral majority. The government made it illegal to racially segregate schools in 1954 in the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and the schools that held on the longest to their right to racially segregate were Christian universities, of course. And then in 1971, the Supreme Court decided that any Christian school that chooses to still racially segregate will lose its tax-exempt status. And over the next 5 years, some Christian university presidents fought this, such as Bob Jones Jr. of Bob Jones University and Jerry Falwell Sr. of Lynchburg Christian School, later renamed Liberty University. And then in 1976, they lost this fight and their tax-exempt status was taken away. The conservative activist Paul Weyrich had been trying to find ways to mobilize evangelicals behind Republican campaigns, and he tried to get them to care about issue after issue, and none of it worked. And then finally, this issue actually seemed promising. And Weyrich used this recent defeat to launch the Moral Majority, a coalition with Republican politicians and evangelical ministers, with the goal of electing Republicans that would fight for the rights of evangelicals and starting with their fight to keep their schools racially segregated. And they made this decision by blaming their racial segregation defeat on Democrat President Jimmy Carter, even though the decision was initially made under Republican President Richard Nixon. So they used the racial segregation issue to rally evangelical leaders into the movement, but that issue wasn't working to mobilize evangelical voters en masse. And so after some think tanks, someone raised their hand and said, "How about abortion?" 5 years after Roe v. Wade. And it stuck. They got evangelical leaders Francis Schaeffer and his son Frank Schaeffer to make these pro-life propaganda films that blamed the moral decay of America on secular humanism. And they used these films to go all over the country and convince evangelical leaders to change their position from pro-choice to pro-life. And after these evangelical leaders saw all these losses that were happening in government, this promise of a coalition that would lead to evangelical success in government made them just go with whatever they were saying. And getting Reagan in office solidified the influence of the moral majority. And I could go on and on and on with this story, but I'm only giving you this background to say that the moral majority tapped into that discouragement and bitterness that evangelicals were feeling after losing prayer in schools and having to integrate black people, and they used those emotions to manufacture the modern evangelical persecution complex as we know it today. They shifted their primary issue to abortion and then gay marriage, using the same rhetoric that launched their movement. The moral majority's foundational argument was, Democrats hate Christians because Democrats won't let us have white-only schools, so vote for Republicans that will allow us to have white-only schools. And then they just kept the same argument and just replaced the issue after issue after issue. But the more you play that game, the more weird and illogical your argument ends up sounding. Because one day you're saying, Democrats hate Christians because Democrats love and support abortion, and so vote for Republicans that are against abortion. And it's like, sure, okay. And then they're saying Democrats hate Christians because Democrats want to stop people from discriminating against gay people, and so vote for Republicans that will allow you to keep discriminating against gay people. And it's like, wait, what? And then they're saying Democrats hate Christians because Democrats want to let trans people go into whatever bathroom they want, and so vote for Republicans that won't allow that to happen. And it's just now just weird and confusing at this point. And then it gets to a point where they're just making stuff up about Democrats and making them sound way cooler than they actually are. Saying Democrats hate Christians and America because Democrats are a bunch of socialists, so vote for Republicans that are against socialism. And it's like the argument has just completely devolved into nonsense by now. Which is why so many people have just completely jumped ship from both the Republican Party and evangelicalism over the last 4 years. The modern evangelical persecution complex was manufactured for the purpose of getting more Republicans in office. But manufacturing a persecution complex has always played a role in societies where those with power would divert blame for societal unrest by scapegoating a minority group as the cause for all of society's problems. And then suppression of that minority group is justified by those with power claiming that we're actually the ones being persecuted by them. Or if they were given equal freedoms, then they would be the real persecutors if given the opportunity. This has been a game played to justify all sorts of persecution throughout history, claimed to be the real victims of potential persecution in order to continue persecuting scapegoated groups. Notice this. In the United States, when people talk about being persecuted by Christians, it is usually paired with an argument against Christian supremacy in favor of equal freedoms. But when Christians talk about being persecuted in the United States, it's usually paired with an argument against equal freedoms in favor of retaining Christian supremacy. Historically, that's always been the exact situation whenever Christians have argued against the abolition of slavery, against racial desegregation, against abortion rights, against women's equality, against gay marriage, against trans rights, against other religions having religious freedoms, and so on. Let me just run it back one more time and repeat it again, because I think it really sums up why this whole Christian persecution complex in the United States is completely bullshit. When people talk about being persecuted by Christians in the United States, it is usually paired with an argument for equal freedoms against Christian supremacy. And when Christians talk about being persecuted in the United States, it is usually paired with an argument for Christian supremacy against equal freedoms. So, American Christians, you are not being persecuted. You have been manipulated to think you are for other people's alternative agendas. And I'll end with this. Christians, learn to live with difference. A strong faith should be confident and secure in your own personal convictions and therefore not afraid of difference. A strong faith should lead one to embrace the other, not exclude the other. It should be your Christian duty to practice radical hospitality for those who are different from you, and to sincerely love those who are different from you. And as those who practice this already know, this is the way that we grow. That's how it works. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe so you can watch more videos like this. Check me out on Twitch, twitch.tv/whoisdamon. Also, if you want to support me, check out my Patreon, patreon.com/Damon Garcia. I appreciate everyone who's already supported me already over there. And I would greatly appreciate it if you considered supporting me as well. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.